The spray of the ocean was a cold slap, a stark reminder that Dean was severing ties, not just with the mainland, but with a life that had become a suffocating shroud. The ferry, a rust-streaked behemoth, churned the slate-gray water into a frothing wake as it pushed through the dense, clinging fog. He stood at the bow, gripping the cold rail, the salt wind biting at his exposed skin. He'd packed his life into a few crates, mostly antique cartography tools, and the worn, leather-bound journals that had once been his comfort, now just a testament to what he'd lost. The map of his own future had been rendered blank, and this remote island, the inheritance of a grandfather he'd barely known, was its new, desolate margin. Now the old man's cottage waited, a relic on a forgotten rock. He hoped this island, this distant speck of land, might finally grant him that peace, or at least a quiet place to unravel. The island finally materialized through the mist, a jagged silhouette against the bruised sky. It was smaller than he'd imagined, a windswept hump of rock and sparse, gnarled trees. Atop its highest point, the lighthouse stood sentinel, a stoic finger pointing towards an indifferent heaven. Below it, nestled into the craggy shoreline, was the cottage, a squat stone structure that looked as if it had grown organically from the land itself, weathered and gray. The ferry shuddered to a halt at a small, dilapidated dock. A single figure, the boatman, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and salt, nodded curtly to Dean as he disembarked. No greetings, no pleasantries, just a shared understanding of the island's stark isolation. Dean hauled his crates onto the uneven planks. The path to the cottage was overgrown, winding past tussocks of tough grass and skeletal bushes that clawed at the air. With each step, the ferry's engine faded, replaced by the relentless sigh of the ocean and the mournful cries of gulls. Dean found himself listening intently, not for anything specific, but for anything to break the heavy stillness. Paint peeled from the window frames like sunburnt skin. The roof tiles were encrusted with moss and lichen, and a single rusted weather vane on the chimney spun lazily in the wind, groaning a protest that sounded almost like a sigh. The air inside was thick and stale, laden with the scent of dust, damp stone, and something metallic, like old pennies. Dean stepped over the threshold, his boots kicking up motes of dust that danced in the slivers of weak light filtering through grimy windows. He ran a hand over a dust-laden table, tracing the ghost of a forgotten pattern. His grandfather's presence, or rather his absence, was palpable. He felt a peculiar ache, a grief for a connection never made. He began the slow, methodical process of uncovering, of making the place his own. He pulled the sheets from a worn armchair, revealing faded floral upholstery. He tried to rationalize it, the dampness, the sea air seeping through the old stone walls. But it felt more deliberate, like an unseen presence observing his every move. In what must have been his grandfather's study, a small, cramped room overlooking the churning sea, Dean found a sturdy wooden desk. On it, amidst a scattered collection of nautical charts and forgotten pipes, lay a leather-bound journal. Its cover was embossed with a faded, intricate design. A compass rose intertwined with what looked like stylized waves. This was not the neat, precise cartography he was used to. This was something else. He opened it, the brittle pages crumbling slightly at his touch. It wasn't a personal diary, but a log. A weather station logbook, judging by the precise date and time entries at the top of each page. He began to read, his eyes scanning the neat, spidery script. Most entries were mundane. Wind, NW 15 knots. Temp, 8 degrees C. Visibility, 2 miles. Fog. But as he flipped through the pages, the entries grew stranger, more erratic. Sound from deep, sustained vibration. Not seismic, not atmospheric. Origin unknown. Then, pressure dropping too fast. Barometer acting strangely. Humming. Later still, lights under waves. Not fishing vessels, moving with intent. The handwriting grew shaky, the ink smudged in places, as if the writer's hand had trembled. The latest entry, dated just a few weeks prior, was almost illegible. The pact. They stir. This wasn't the log of a sane man monitoring the elements. This was the desperate scrawl of someone losing their grip, wrestling with something far beyond the realm of meteorology. He looked up from the journal, his gaze drawn to the window, where the fog had thickened into an impenetrable wall. The rhythmic groan of the lighthouse beam was the only sound now, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. But beneath it, or perhaps within it, he thought he heard something else. It was a sound that shouldn't exist, a sound that seemed to pull at the very fabric of his sanity. Dean felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't the log of a sane man monitoring the elements. He looked up from the journal, his gaze drawn to the window, where the fog, thick and gray, pressed against the glass like a shroud. Its tendrils seemed to writhe, not just drift, obscuring the familiar horizon and muting the distant roar of the ocean into a low, guttural murmur. He set the weathered logbook aside, the rough leather cover cool beneath his fingertips. His eyes, accustomed to the precise lines of maps, scanned the churning expanse of gray. He was a man of logic, of measurable contours and predictable currents. Yet for the past few days since his arrival, the island's rhythm had felt off. The tide, for instance. He'd observed it meticulously from the cottage's small, drafty porch, watching the water creep further up the shingle beach than it had any right to, then recede with an unnatural swiftness, leaving behind slick, dark stones that glistened ominously. It wasn't a storm surge. The air had been still, heavy. He needed data, he told himself, something concrete to disprove the growing unease. He thought of his grandfather, a man he barely knew, now a ghost whose erratic handwriting haunted him. What had the old keeper been seeing out here? Later that afternoon, after a meager meal of tinned soup, Dean found himself drawn to the small, dilapidated structure perched precariously on a rocky outcrop, a short walk from the cottage, the island's official weather station. It was a relic, a squat, concrete box with a rusted anemometer atop its roof, spinning listlessly in the heavy air. Inside, the air hung thick with the scent of salt, mildew, and something else. A faint, metallic tang he couldn't place. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that pierced the grimy windows. This place was meant for objective observation, for recording the undeniable facts of wind speed and rainfall. But even here, a subtle disquiet began to prickle at him. Or was it just the wind? He listened closer. The sound wasn't uniform. It ebbed and flowed, rising and falling in pitch, almost an inflection. He shook his head. The isolation was getting to him, twisting the natural sounds of the island into something sinister. He was tired, and the old journal had put ideas in his head. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a suggestion of them, a sibilant murmur that raised the hairs on his arms. He spun around, searching the empty room, his heart thumping a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Nothing. Just the peeling paint on the walls, the dusty instruments, the lingering scent of damp. "It's just the wind," he muttered aloud, his voice sounding thin and unconvincing even to himself. Determined to find something tangible, Dean began methodically searching the weather station. He checked the old water-stained charts, the corroded barometer, the damp-stained logbooks. Most were filled with mundane entries, but one, tucked away in a grimy wooden drawer beneath a stack of rusted tools, caught his eye. Its pages were warped, almost fused together in places, the ink bleeding into fuzzy, illegible blots. He carefully pried it open. This wasn't a logbook. It was a journal, filled with his grandfather's frantic hand. The script was even more agitated than in the previous log, often smeared as if written in haste or in tears. Dean's breath hitched as he turned a page. There, amidst the faded script, were crude, disturbing sketches. Not maps, not charts, but swirling, intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with an unholy energy. Shapes like distorted tentacles, eyes that stared out from impossible depths, and vast, undulating forms that defied classification. And then he saw it, scrawled repeatedly in thick, almost manic strokes across several pages, sometimes underlined with desperate intensity. The deep song. It sings, it calls. The tides obey the deep song. Don't listen. He gripped the journal, its waterlogged pages cool and clammy against his skin. The scientific mind, the cartographer's instinct for order, screamed at him to dismiss it all as delusion. The strange tides were an anomaly, a rare convergence of lunar forces. But the sketches... Dean looked around the small weather station. Its purpose to record objective reality now felt like a cage. He looked out the window again, the fog still pressing, the low murmur of the ocean now seeming to carry a cadence, a subtle, rhythmic thrum that resonated deep within his bones. He couldn't shake the feeling that the island itself was listening, waiting, its secrets slowly unfurling around him. The determination to rationalize warred with a primal, creeping fear. He was no longer just an observer. He was caught in its strange, terrible melody. The chill of the island's perpetual mist clung to Dean even after he had pulled the thick wool blanket to his chin. The words from his grandfather's journal, scrawled in a hand that had grown increasingly erratic, echoed in his mind. Fighting's... It wasn't a battle against the sea or the elements. Not in the way Dean had always understood. It was something else. Something that hummed with a cold, ancient malice just beneath the surface of his perception. He had to know. He needed to know. The drive was an insistent, gnawing thing, overriding the fatigue that tried to drag his back into a restless sleep. He rose with the first gray light, the cottage groaning around him as if sharing his unease. The air was thick with the smell of salt and damp earth. He started his search in his grandfather's study, a small room crammed with a lifetime's worth of books, charts, and peculiar instruments Dean didn't recognize. He ran his hand over the spines of leather-bound tomes, feeling the rough texture of aged paper. Many were navigational guides, tide tables, or obscure meteorological texts. But nestled amongst them, tucked away on a lower shelf, were a few volumes that seemed out of place. One, bound in faded linen, was titled Island Lore and Coastal Legends. Dean pulled it out, a cloud of dust puffing into the air. The pages, brittle and yellowed, crackled as he opened it. The ink had bled slightly in places, but the script was still legible. He skimmed through tales of shipwrecks and phantom lights, the usual seafaring myths. Then a specific section caught his eye. The drowned city of Ythar. He leaned closer, his breath catching. The text spoke of an ancient civilization, long predating any recorded history of the island, swallowed by the ocean in a cataclysmic event. Hinting at rituals performed on the longest nights, offerings made to an entity described only as the sleeper beneath. A shiver traced its way down Dean's spine. The book didn't just mention legends. It presented them with an unnerving conviction, citing local fishermen's accounts of strange lights beneath the waves and a peculiar rhythmic thrumming sound heard on moonless nights. He turned back to his grandfather's journal, the one he'd found on the desk. Another entry, dated years later, simply stated, "It stirs. The bargain is broken." Dean's hands trembled as he held the journal. His grandfather hadn't just been a recluse. He had been an unwilling guardian, burdened by a terrible secret. The S wasn't a monster of the mind. It was a consequence, an ancient evil awakened by a fractured agreement. That night, the dreams began. They weren't the usual fragmented images of sleep. These were vivid, tactile, and terrifyingly real. He was submerged in an infinite blackness, the pressure of the deep crushing his chest. He felt an immense, unseen presence coiled around him, not hostile, but utterly indifferent, ancient beyond comprehension. There was a sound, a low, resonant thrumming that vibrated through his bones, a song without melody, a language without words, yet it communicated a profound, primordial hunger. The first thing he noticed was the faint, otherworldly glow. It emanated from a hairline crack in the plaster near the window frame. He pushed himself out of bed, his legs unsteady, and approached cautiously. It wasn't moonlight. A delicate, shimmering growth, like microscopic tendrils, pulsed with a soft, phosphorescent light, a pale blue-green. Bioluminescent algae. He touched it, and it felt cool and slightly slimy, leaving a faint, ethereal sheen on his fingertip. He wiped it off with a shudder. He found more of it. A faint patch on the sill of the kitchen window, another clinging to the underside of a shelf in the pantry. Almost like a fungal growth, but alien. Too bright, too alive. It was encroaching, silently, insidiously. A desperate need for answers, for anything concrete, clawed at him. The weather station. His grandfather had kept meticulous records there. Maybe there was something in the official logs, something beyond the fantastical tales and the journal's cryptic warnings. The walk to the weather station was a blur of driving mist and the relentless moan of the wind. The small, squat building, perched precariously on a windswept bluff, looked like a forgotten sentinel. Its antennae, usually humming with activity, were silent, coated in a fine layer of salt and grime. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of ozone and disuse. Old charts were still tacked to the walls, some curling at the edges, detailing barometric pressure and wind speeds from decades past. Dean's eyes scanned the shelves, searching for his grandfather's specific logbooks. He found them, bound in sturdy canvas, each one meticulously dated. He opened the most recent one, his fingers tracing the familiar, careful script. There were sketches, not of weather patterns, of strange, undulating currents far beneath the surface, described as unnatural movements. Alongside them were notes, not about atmospheric pressure. The words from his grandfather's journal, scrawled in a hand that had grown increasingly erratic, echoed in his mind. Fightings. It wasn't a battle against the sea or the elements. He knew now. The something his grandfather fought was far older, far deeper. He woke to the faint groan of the cottage timbers, a familiar sound, but today it seemed to carry a new resonance. A low, almost imperceptible thrum that vibrated deep in his bones. Dean pushed himself upright, the wool scratching against his cheek. He'd left his old brass compass on the small bedside table last night, its needle pointing north with unwavering precision. Now it lay on the floor, several feet from the table facing east. He hadn't touched it since setting it down. He knelt, picking it up. The glass was cold. He returned it to the table, watching it intently, but it remained still. He told himself it must have rolled off, a loose floorboard, a tremor he hadn't felt. The rational explanations felt thin, like stretched canvas. Throughout the morning, the unsettling occurrences continued, subtle at first, then more pronounced. A pewter mug he'd placed on the kitchen counter shifted, scraping faintly against the stone, as if nudged by an unseen hand. He watched it, frozen, until it stilled. It carried with it the distinct smell of salt, and something else, something ancient, like wet stone and decaying kelp. He shivered, pulling his cardigan tighter. It was a sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his chest, a vibrational hum that made his teeth ache. He pressed his palms to his temples, trying to block it out, but it was inside him, a parasitic frequency. He tried to focus on his work, but his hand shook, the ink bleeding on the parchment. He passed the small, tarnished mirror in the hallway, catching his own reflection. For a split second, the image rippled, as if viewed through disturbed water. He blinked, and the distortion vanished, leaving only his tired, pale face staring back. What was happening to him? Was the solitude eroding his mind? Or was something truly here, watching him, toying with him? Driven by a desperate need for answers, Dean went to his grandfather's study, the room he'd mostly avoided. He began systematically searching, pulling out books, emptying drawers. He found no more journal entries, but in a hidden compartment behind a loose floorboard near the hearth, he discovered a small wooden box. Inside, nestled amongst dried seaweed and strangely carved pieces of bone, were several crudely drawn maps. They weren't navigational charts. They were diagrams of the island, marked with symbols Dean didn't recognize. Spirals, jagged lines, and circles. Along the margins, scrawled in his grandfather's increasingly desperate hand, were phrases like the deep hunger and offerings for the tide. His grandfather hadn't been trying to fight it, not entirely. He'd been trying to appease it. The hum grew louder, a deep bass note that vibrated through the floor. It felt like the island itself was singing, a vast, malevolent chorus. Dean knew he needed to get out, to find some perspective, some proof that he wasn't losing his grip. He thought of the weather station, a small, sturdy structure perched on the island's highest point, a short, exposed walk from the cottage. His grandfather had kept meticulous records there. Perhaps there would be something, anything, to explain the inexplicable. He pulled on his thickest coat, grabbing a lantern, the old glass chimney rattling with each step. The wind outside was a relentless shriek, carrying the dense, wet mist with it. The walk to the weather station was a struggle against the elements, the path slick with sea spray. The hum was fainter out here, masked by the roar of the wind, but he could still feel it, a persistent ache behind his eyes. Inside, old charts hung askew, and a dusty anemometer whirred softly on the roof above. Dean found his grandfather's logbooks, their pages brittle with age. In the margins of several entries from months before his grandfather's disappearance, there were strange notations. Sudden, inexplicable drops in temperature at sea level, pressure readings that plummeted to impossible lows. His grandfather hadn't just heard it. He had measured its presence. The glass panes of the windows rattled violently, not from the wind, but from the deep, resonant frequency. A ripple, like heat haze over a desert road, shimmered in the air. It wasn't air, though. It was a distortion, a displacement of the very light, taking on the vague, indistinct shape of something vast and fluid. Dean couldn't discern features, no eyes or limbs, just an immense, shifting mass, formless yet undeniably there. It didn't move towards him, not exactly, but the space between them seemed to shrink, the air growing impossibly heavy. He felt its vastness, its crushing weight, its profound emptiness. He couldn't breathe. This was it. This was the something. It was here. With a strangled gasp, Dean stumbled backward, overturning a stool, the clang echoing in the small room. The movement broke the spell. He scrambled out of the weather station, fumbling with the latch, the wind tearing at his clothes. He ran back towards the cottage, not caring about the path, the rocks, the biting mist. His grandfather hadn't been fighting a storm. He had been fighting this. And it had finally found Dean. The chill of the island's perpetual mist still clung to Dean, a damp shroud that had settled deep into his bones overnight. He had pulled the thick wool blanket to his chin, but the cold was not merely external. It was something far older, far more insidious. He rose with a leaden weariness, the taste of stale salt on his tongue. The cottage felt different this morning, heavier, as if the very air had absorbed a deeper layer of the island's ancient sorrow. He found the journal exactly where he'd left it, splayed open on the rough-hewn table. His fingers trembled slightly as he traced the faded ink, pushing past the fragmented fighting Sia entry. The subsequent pages were a jumble of observations, half-formed theories, and increasingly desperate pleas. Dean deciphered phrases. The binding holds. The appeasement must be precise. The deep song rises with the tide. It wasn't just observation, he realized with a sickening lurch in his gut. His grandfather hadn't been a passive chronicler of the island's secrets. He had been an active participant, a frantic keeper of a terrible pact. The old man wasn't fighting something as an adversary. He was maintaining a fragile peace, performing a ritual to keep the entity dormant. A low thrum began, subtle at first, a vibration deep within the floorboards beneath his feet. He dismissed it as the island's natural pulse. The wind, the waves, the old house settling. Offering? He pushed the thought away, his mind scrambling for a more rational explanation. Perhaps his grandfather had simply been a meticulous record keeper, and the weather station provided the necessary data. He pulled on his thickest oilskins and stepped out into the swirling gray. The mist was a living thing today, coiling around his legs, obscuring the path to the weather station. The thrumming, the deep song, was more pronounced out here. A pervasive hum that seemed to emanate from the very ground, from the heart of the island itself. Inside, the air was stagnant, thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying paper. A single grimy window overlooked the churning sea. On a workbench, beneath a layer of dust so thick it looked like gray felt, Dean found an old logbook. Its pages were brittle, yellowed, filled with his grandfather's familiar spidery hand. It wasn't just meteorological data. Interspersed between wind speeds and barometric pressures were cryptic notations. The pull strengthens, 3 bells. The melody deepens, 7 bells. The barrier thins, the tide retreats. He saw specific dates, marked with an ominous X, coinciding with periods of unusual seismic activity noted in the journal back at the cottage. His grandfather had been tracking something far more profound than weather patterns. He was charting the entity's awakening. As Dean read, the deep song intensified. The lines of text in the logbook began to waver, the ink bleeding into indistinct blurs. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, but the distortion persisted. He could almost feel the weight of the ocean above him, the immense pressure of untold fathoms. He slammed the logbook shut, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the small space. The weather station, designed to measure objective reality, was now a conduit for something else entirely. Back in the relative familiarity of the lighthouse cottage, the deep song was a constant throbbing presence. He looked down at the journal, now back on the table, and his eyes fell upon a sketch. A rough diagram of the lighthouse, but with an added ominous detail. A series of descending steps, leading to a chamber marked with a single archaic symbol that resembled a gaping maw. The true foundation. His grandfather's scrawl read beside it. The heart beneath the light. There, the binding holds. Dean's gaze swept around the ground floor of the lighthouse, a desperate search for anything that matched the diagram. He ran his hand along the cool stone walls, the ancient mortar. Then he felt it. A section near the base, subtly different. He knelt, tracing the outline of a nearly invisible seam, expertly disguised. He pushed harder, testing, feeling for a catch or a lever. The air that wafted up was thick with the smell of brine and something else, something utterly primeval, like wet earth and forgotten things. He stood at the threshold, the world tilting, the line between reality and hallucination dissolving into the echoing roar of the deep. The stone, when Dean pressed it, did not merely give way. It receded with a low, grinding sigh, as if the very bedrock of the island exhaled. A seam, impossibly fine, appeared along the wall, tracing a perfect rectangular outline from floor to ceiling. He heard the click of ancient tumblers, slow and deliberate, followed by a deeper thrum that vibrated through the soles of his boots. Then, with a groan that seemed to tear at the foundations, the section of wall swung inward, revealing not another room, but a narrow, winding passage that plunged into absolute darkness. A current of air, stale and heavy with the scent of brine and something else. Something profoundly old, like forgotten earth mixed with decay, wafted out. Dean hesitated, his hand still resting on the rough stone, feeling the residual vibration. His heart, usually a steady drum, began to beat a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was it. The place his grandfather had hidden, the secret he had guarded. He pulled the wall open further, the sound echoing in the sudden void. He retrieved his lantern, its beam cutting a hesitant swath through the gloom. The passage was unlined, raw earth and rock, sloping downwards at a steep angle. He could hear the drip of unseen water, a monotonous counterpoint to his own ragged breathing. The walls felt slick under his fingertips, occasionally giving way to patches of something soft, almost fungal. He tried not to think about what might have grown here, undisturbed for decades. The descent felt endless, a journey into the island's very core. Finally, the passage opened into a chamber. It was not vast, but its proportions felt wrong, the ceiling too low, the walls curving in an unsettling way. The air here was thick, heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang. There, on a low, crudely carved stone pedestal, rested the source of the light. It was an object unlike anything Dean had ever seen. Not an artifact in the conventional sense, but a pulsating mass of what appeared to be solidified water, though it defied all logic. It seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding with a slow, rhythmic beat that Dean felt deep in his bones, not just heard with his ears. A faint hum, barely audible, resonated from it, a sound that seemed to pull at the edges of his thoughts, threatening to unravel them. He took a step closer, compelled by an instinct he couldn't name. This was no mere rock or relic. This was a focal point, a condensed fragment of something immense, something truly other. It was a window, perhaps, or a heart, and it was alive. He understood, with a terrible, dawning clarity, that this pulsating mass was not just from the entity. It was the entity, or at least an extension of it, a conduit. Its true nature was not merely ancient or deep, but boundless, a consciousness that had existed before the land, before the sky, lurking in the unplumbed blackness beneath the world. It was a vastness that dwarfed human comprehension, an intelligence so alien it defied definition. Yet its presence here was undeniable, palpable. As Dean stared, mesmerized and terrified, the hum deepened, vibrating through his skull. The chamber seemed to dim, the phosphorescent light from the object becoming the only illumination. The air grew impossibly heavy, pressing down on him, stealing his breath. Then the swirling colors within the object intensified, coalescing not into shapes, but into images. A vision assaulted his mind, unbidden and brutal. He saw the island, but it was not the familiar landmass. Its shores were crumbling, swallowed by an encroaching black tide. The lighthouse, his home, stood alone, a skeletal finger against a roiling, ink-dark sky, its light extinguished. Then the vision narrowed, focusing on him. He saw himself, but he was no longer Dean. His skin was pale, translucent, his eyes wide and vacant, reflecting only the endless churning blackness. He was a vessel, a conduit, his identity dissolved, his consciousness absorbed into the vast, indifferent will of the entity. The images flickered, then receded, leaving Dean gasping for air, clutching at his chest. The hum lessened, the light softened, but the memory of the vision was seared into his mind. His breath hitched, ragged and shallow. It wanted the island. And it was no longer merely stirring. It was awake, and it was here. The low, grinding sigh of the receding stone echoed in the confined space. a sound like a vast ancient lung emptying itself. Dean stared, his breath catching in his throat, at the narrow rectangular opening now revealed. Beyond it, not a brightly lit chamber, but an abyssal darkness that seemed to drink the meager light filtering from the cottage's single lantern. A chill, sharper and more profound than the island's usual dampness, seeped from the gap, carrying with it the metallic tang of old iron and the faint, unsettling perfume of salt-laced decay. He hesitated, a knot of primal fear tightening in his stomach. This was it. The secret his grandfather had guarded, the truth that had driven the old man to madness, or worse. Every instinct screamed for him to seal the passage, to pretend he'd never seen it, to flee the island. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Dean squeezed through the newly revealed aperture. The stone scraped against his shoulder, a physical reminder of the island's unyielding nature. He found himself in a low, tight tunnel, barely wide enough for his frame, the air heavy and still. The tunnel sloped downwards, the floor slick with what felt like condensation. He could hear a faint, rhythmic drip somewhere ahead, a sound that seemed to measure the passage of some immeasurable time. This wasn't a cellar or a simple storage room. The air here was different, thick with an almost palpable pressure, and the metallic tang was stronger, mingled with the unmistakable scent of ozone after a lightning strike. Dean's lantern beam cut through the gloom, revealing the skeletal remains of rusted equipment. Dials frozen on impossible readings, corroded levers, and a tall skeletal anemometer, its cups long since vanished, reaching towards a collapsed section of the ceiling. This was the old weather station, not the small derelict hut he knew, but a forgotten underground extension of it, hidden beneath the island's weathered skin. A low thrum vibrated through the stone floor, a vibration that didn't come from any machinery. It resonated in his bones, a deep, resonant hum that felt less like sound and more like a presence. It was in his head, behind his eyes, pushing at the fragile walls of his perception. Dean felt a sudden, profound vertigo, the floor seeming to tilt beneath him, the walls to breathe. He was not just seeing it. He was feeling it, the entity. It was here, closer than ever before, its tendrils reaching, not for his body, but for the very core of his mind. He tasted salt in his mouth, though there was no sea spray, and felt a crushing weight against his chest, as if the deepest ocean pressed in on him. It was insidious, tempting, a siren song for a soul already adrift. Dean stumbled back, fear solidifying into a desperate resolve. This wasn't just a haunting. It was an invasion. He was trapped, deep beneath the island, with something that wanted to consume him. He needed answers, and he needed them now. His grandfather's journal. He'd left it on the small table in the cottage, just a few yards back through the tunnel. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, Dean spun, scrambling back towards the narrow opening. He fought through the tight passage, his breath ragged, the sounds of the weather station fading only slightly behind him. Bursting back into the relative familiarity of the cottage, Dean didn't pause. His eyes darted to the small, oil-stained journal lying open on the table. He snatched it up, his fingers fumbling as he flipped through the brittle pages, ignoring the earlier entries, his gaze scanning for anything that spoke of a solution, a defense, an escape. The pages blurred, filled with his grandfather's frantic script, diagrams of constellations that weren't quite right, and strange geometric patterns. He stopped abruptly at a series of pages marked by frantic underlining and marginal notes. The ink was faded, but the urgency of the words still bled through. It wasn't a complete ritual, but a fragmented account, a desperate attempt to piece together what his grandfather had learned. Words like breach, seal, containment jumped out at him. And then, a section detailing the requirements. The binding, his grandfather had scrawled, the letters thick with despair, requires a vessel, a conduit, a life given willingly, not in fear, but in understanding. a tether strong enough to pull it back, to seal the gate forever. The greatest sacrifice is not of blood, but of essence, to offer the anchor of one's own existence, to become the barrier itself, to cease to be so that it cannot be. Dean's eyes widened, his mind struggling to comprehend. A life given willingly. Not a life, but his life. To become the barrier. To cease to be. The words spun in his head, a horrifying revelation. It wasn't about destroying the entity, but about containing it, sealing it away, and the price was absolute. He could run, try to escape the island, knowing the entity would simply follow, or worse, spread. Or he could face it, confront the horror, and offer the one thing he still possessed: himself. The thought was paralyzing, yet strangely, a fierce determination began to harden in his chest. He was no hero, just a man haunted by loss. But perhaps in this final terrible act, he could find a purpose that had eluded him for so long. The entity's thrumming intensified, a triumphant crescendo, as if it sensed his dawning comprehension, his terrible, desperate plan. The island was a wound, festering. A sickly, green-tinged fog had rolled in days ago and never retreated, clinging to the crags and seeping into every crevice, carrying with it a scent of decay that was both metallic and marine. The air itself felt heavy, a thick, viscous blanket pressing down, making each breath a conscious effort. It was reaching, probing, its tendrils of malice stretching across the land, twisting reality with a slow, agonizing deliberation. He had seen the changes. The gulls no longer cried, only shrieked, their calls ragged and desperate, their eyes often milky white. The familiar gnarled trees that dotted the cliffs had begun to weep a dark, oily sap that stained the gray rock. Patches of kelp on the shore, usually vibrant, were now bloated and pale, pulsing faintly as if with a diseased life. The ocean, once a source of comfort, now seemed to churn with an unnatural frenzy, its waves crashing against the rocks with a hunger Dean had never witnessed. The sound was a ceaseless guttural roar, a prelude to something terrible. Dean clutched the weathered journal, its pages brittle beneath his fingers. He had read the final entries a dozen times, each word a hammer blow to his core. A life given willingly, to become the barrier. He would become the seal, the living cage. The thought did not bring peace, but a grim, unyielding purpose. The grief that had driven him to this desolate place had been a consuming fire. Now it had burned itself down to ash, leaving only the scaffolding of his will. His grandfather, the previous keeper, had understood. The journal spoke of a convergence point, a place where the ley lines of the island intersected, a nexus of its natural energies and the entity's encroaching influence. It was a place designed to observe the weather, yes, but also to feel the island's pulse. The weather station. His gaze fell upon the harpoon he had used to defend himself from the grotesque creature in the cave. It was crude, heavy, but its steel tip gleamed dully in the dim light of the cottage. He took it, not for defense, but as a symbolic anchor, a connection to the raw, ancient struggle his grandfather had faced. As he stepped out, the wind howled, a mournful lament that clawed at his clothes. The fog was thicker than ever, a tangible presence that tasted of salt and something metallic, like old blood. He could feel the pressure on his mind intensify, a dull ache blooming into a searing pain behind his eyes. He squeezed them shut for a moment, fighting back the nausea that threatened to overwhelm him. The entity was aware, he realized, aware of his intent, lashing out with its vast, formless consciousness. The path to the weather station was treacherous, winding along the exposed cliff face. Loose stones skittered under his boots, plummeting into the unseen depths below. The wind threatened to rip him from his footing, a malevolent force trying to push him into the churning gray maw of the sea. Dean pressed on, his head down, focused only on the next step. He reached the weather station just as a fresh deluge of rain began to lash down, driven horizontally by the gale. Its metal instruments, once gleaming, were streaked with rust, some bent into grotesque, useless shapes by the relentless storms. A wind vane spun wildly, its arrow pointing in every direction at once, a testament to the chaos that reigned. Dean pulled out his lantern, its beam cutting a shaky path through the gloom. The interior was sparse. A desk, a few charts pinned to a corkboard, a radio unit long dead. But it was on the desk that he found it, the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. Tucked beneath a stack of faded logbooks was a small, lead-bound box. Its surface was cool and rough beneath his touch. With trembling fingers, Dean opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried seaweed, was a single, smooth black stone. It was obsidian, he realized, but unlike any he had ever seen. It pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, a deep, indigo glow that seemed to drink the light from his lantern. And beside it, a small, tightly rolled parchment. He unrolled it carefully. The script was his grandfather's, precise and firm, but the words were stark. The heart of the deep requires a counterheart, a resonance. The stone is a conduit, the self, the anchor. At the highest point, when the storm reaches its zenith and the entity's hunger is absolute, then the pact can be remade. One life given to mend the tear. The barrier becomes you. Dean's eyes widened, his mind struggling to comprehend the full implication. The stone was not merely a symbol, but a focal point, a receiver. And he was the anchor, the living sacrifice. He would become the living prison. He looked around the small, desolate room, then up at the ceiling, where a hatch led to the station's roof, the highest point on this part of the island. The storm outside was intensifying, the wind now a banshee's shriek, the rain hammering like 1,000 tiny fists. The entity was rising, its presence a crushing weight that threatened to buckle his knees. It was time. The zenith, the hunger, the immense personal cost, the complete cessation of his existence, no longer felt like a distant horror, but an immediate, inevitable truth. He was the barrier, he was the anchor, he was the end. With a grim, unyielding determination, he began to climb the ladder towards the hatch, towards the maelstrom, towards his final purpose. The grim clarity of his fate settled upon Dean like a shroud woven from sea mist and despair. He was the anchor, the living sacrifice. The knowledge did not break him. It forged a terrifying resolve. There was no escape, only this terrible, necessary act. He moved with a desperate urgency, the wind a howling banshee around the cottage, rattling windows that had long since lost their battle with the salt and spray. The air itself felt thick, vibrating with an unseen pressure, a low hum that resonated in his bones. He clutched the heavy, smooth stone he'd found, the one his grandfather had carved, its surface now pulsing with a faint internal luminescence that mirrored the frantic beating of his own heart. His path lay toward the lighthouse, but a detour called him, an instinct born of his grandfather's cryptic notes. He veered north, battling the relentless gale towards the island's dilapidated weather station. As he approached, the wind howled through the station's broken windows, creating a chorus of moans and whistles that sounded sickeningly like tortured voices. The door, long since torn from its hinges, hung askew, groaning on a single strained bolt. Inside, the instruments were in disarray, gauges shattered, wires ripped from their conduits. A thick, briny smell, like stagnant tide pools and something profoundly dead, hung heavy in the air. This was no ordinary decay. It was the stench of something ancient and unholy stirring beneath the waves. Dean stepped over a fallen anemometer, its cups bent and twisted like broken fingers. The floor was slick with a thin, gelatinous film that shimmered faintly in the gloom, reflecting the eerie glow of the stone in his hand. He felt the entity's presence here more acutely. a cold, probing intelligence that seemed to scrape against the inside of his skull. He fought to keep his mind from unraveling, focusing on the task at hand. His grandfather's final, hurried sketch indicated a hidden compartment beneath the main console. With trembling hands, Dean knelt, scraping away the viscous film. His fingers found a loose panel, stiff with years of neglect and sea spray corrosion. He wrenched it open, revealing a small, lead-lined box. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried seaweed, was a tarnished brass compass, its needle spinning wildly, no longer pointing north, but oscillating erratically, as if pulled by a dozen competing invisible forces. This was it. This was the final piece. Meant to stabilize the channel, to guide the essence, to contain it. A sound, low and guttural, filled the space. A deep thrumming that vibrated through the very foundations of the island. It was the sound of something vast and terrible, rising. He stumbled out of the weather station, the compass clutched tight, the entity's presence now a tangible weight on his shoulders. The world outside had changed. The fog had thickened into an impenetrable wall, swirling with unnatural currents. Tendrils of mist seemed to writhe, coalesce, and then dissipate, hinting at impossible shapes just beyond his perception. The lighthouse beam, usually a steady, comforting sweep, now pulsed erratically, its light weak and sickly, painting the swirling vapor in shades of sickly green and bruised purple. The ascent to the lighthouse was a gauntlet. The path, once familiar, seemed to shift beneath his feet, the stones slick with an unidentifiable slime. "You are nothing," the wind seemed to keen. "Just a vessel for what comes." He pushed past the phantom voices, his jaw clenched. The lighthouse door, usually bolted, now stood ajar, groaning on its hinges as if inviting him into a waiting maw. The spiral staircase stretched upwards into a gloom that the weak light from the lantern room above could not penetrate. The brass railings were coated in a layer of moisture that felt oddly warm, almost alive. As he began his ascent, the psychological assault intensified. This was a trick, a lure. He had to seal it. He reached the lantern room, the glass panes rattling in their frames, the powerful lamp sputtering, casting erratic bursts of light across the swirling fog outside. The air here was electric, thrumming with an overwhelming power. In the center of the circular room, directly beneath the lamp, the very air seemed to shimmer, distorting the light, creating a wavering portal of deep, swirling blackness. It was not a hole in space, but a tearing of reality, a gateway to something ancient and consuming. This was the place, the anchor, the channel, the seal. He was all of them. With a profound, shuddering breath, Dean stepped into the shimmering distortion. He felt it, the entity's essence, vast, indifferent, and utterly alien, trying to tear him apart from the inside. It was a consciousness beyond comprehension, a hunger beyond satiation. His body convulsed, his muscles screaming in protest as he became a conduit, a living plug. He saw his own life, a tiny, insignificant flicker about to be extinguished. But then, a fierce, protective instinct ignited within him, a refusal to be merely consumed. He would not just be a sacrifice, he would be a prison. He would hold it. He gritted his teeth, pouring every ounce of his will, every memory of love, every fragment of his shattered hope into the act. He was not just channeling, he was containing. The light from the stone intensified, now a blinding, white-hot core within his grasp, radiating outwards, pushing back against the encroaching blackness. The compass needle locked into place, its brass casing humming. He felt the entity's furious, ancient roar of protest as it was forced back, drawn into him, sealed within his very being. Then, with a sound like glass shattering in a vacuum, the shimmering distortion vanished. The air became still, heavy, and silent. Dean stood alone in the lantern room, trembling, utterly drained. The stone in his hand was now dull and inert, the compass still. The entity was gone from the world, sealed away, but not gone entirely. He had closed the portal, but in doing so, he had become the portal himself. His personal sacrifice was complete. He had saved the island, but at what terrible cost to himself? The air within the lighthouse was a heavy, cold curtain, pressing against Dean's skin like wet canvas. Each breath scraped in his throat, tasting of salt and dust. The ancient stone walls, slick with condensation, seemed to weep. He moved through the gloom, his hand trailing along the clammy spiral staircase. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of water somewhere below and the distant, mournful sigh of the foghorn, now seeming to emanate from within the very structure itself. His own footsteps, usually a dull thud, echoed with an unnatural resonance, as if the lighthouse amplified every tremor of his fear. He felt observed, not by eyes, but by a vast, cold awareness that settled on him, seeping into the marrow of his bones. He ascended, his muscles protesting, the climb endless. A narrow, rusted iron door, previously unnoticed, stood ajar at the very top, leading to a small, hidden chamber above the main mechanism. A faint, phosphorescent glow emanated from within. He pushed the door open, the hinges screaming a protest that reverberated through the stone. The chamber was small, circular, its walls covered in what looked like faded, intricate carvings. Not symbols he recognized from any map, but looping, organic patterns that seemed to pulse faintly with the inner light. And within the liquid, half submerged, was a single, barnacle-encrusted brass key, larger than any he'd ever seen. The reveal hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't a lighthouse in the conventional sense, not entirely. This was a lock. This chamber, this liquid, the carvings, they were a mechanism, a seal. His grandfather hadn't just kept the light, he had kept it contained. The pact wasn't about the island, but about this specific, terrible duty. Dean's grief, his arrival, his very presence had been a disruption. The entity hadn't been awakened, it had simply been stirring, the seal weakening, and Dean had provided the final fracture. He felt the deep song not just in his mind, but in his blood, vibrating with an ancient hunger. It was trying to draw him in, to make him complete its release. The key, he knew with absolute certainty, was meant to either sever the connection or strengthen it, to either release the entity entirely or bind it anew. And the cost would be immense. His hand trembled as he reached for the key. He was Dean, he reminded himself, a cartographer. He dealt with lines, with boundaries, with the tangible. But this was beyond the map. He grasped the key. As his fingers closed around it, a searing pain shot through his arm, up his shoulder and into his chest. He cried out, a guttural sound lost in the vastness of the tower. The carvings on the walls flared, and the liquid in the basin churned violently. He saw the choices, laid bare. Let it consume him, become part of its terrible consciousness, and unleash it upon the world. Or finish what his grandfather had started. He didn't know how, but the key felt like the answer. He pulled it from the basin, the pain intensifying, his mind threatening to fracture. He saw a faint, almost invisible keyhole in the center of the chamber's floor, directly beneath the basin. With a desperate, animalistic cry, Dean plunged the key into the keyhole. There was no click, no turning. Instead, a wave of raw energy surged through him, a white-hot current that burned away everything he was. He saw the entity, not as a creature, but as a vast living current of malevolence, held back by a fragile, vibrating membrane. Then, a sudden, violent contraction. The phosphorescent glow faded from the walls, the liquid in the basin stilled, dulling to an oily black. He staggered backward, collapsing against the damp stone wall, gasping for breath. The silence was deafening, the emptiness in his head a greater horror than the previous cacophony. He had done it. He had neutralized the immediate threat. But at what cost? He stumbled out of the lighthouse, the sun now a pale, watery disk behind the dissipating fog. The air outside felt thin, alien. The island itself seemed to hum with a low, resonant frequency that only he could hear. His legs moved mechanically, carrying him away from the lighthouse, away from the scene of his terrible communion. He needed to get somewhere, anywhere, to process the new landscape of his mind. He found himself walking towards the small, isolated structure he had almost forgotten about. The weather station. The wind whipped around him, carrying not the scent of the sea, but the faint, lingering odor of something ancient and unnameable. He pushed open the door to the weather station. The interior was cramped, filled with the click and whir of instruments. A barometer, an anemometer, a thermometer. All mundane tools of measurement. But to Dean, they seemed to be recording not just atmospheric conditions, but the very fabric of reality itself, now subtly altered. He stared at a spinning dial, its needle twitching erratically. He saw patterns in its movements, patterns that spoke of tides and currents. Yes, but also of things moving beneath the waves, things that were not fish or whales. He was alive. He had survived. But the deep song had left its mark. He was no longer just a cartographer mapping the known world. He was now a living chart, etched with the unseen, the unspeakable. The island had released him, but it had taken a piece of his sanity and given him a burden far heavier than any map. He was free, but forever bound to the silent, echoing knowledge of the deep.